All right, Ron, the next thing I want to talk about is another condition that we see in many cases. This involves decks or balconies that are attached to wood frame construction. In your experience as a professional engineer and a forensic building expert, how many decks would you say you have investigated?
Oh, I would say probably thousands.
All right. And what type of decks have you inspected in your experience?
Well, we've looked at some of the more common ones, maybe just an exposed deck, which would mean that rain is going to fall on it. There's no roof over it. In that condition, we've had wood framed decks with just wood framed and wood planking on top of it. Then you may get into the condition where you have a living space that's underneath one, so you have to have basically a waterproofed top surface to the deck. So it would be a wood framed, generally plywood. Then over the top of that you would put different kinds of coatings to make it weather tight.
Have you had any experience with decks that are cantilevered off the building and built on filigree slabs?
Yes, we've had that also.
And for purposes of the people out there, can you explain briefly what that is?
Well, it generally would be one where you have the concrete from inside of the building is continued out to the exterior. That's what makes it cantilevered. It doesn't have a support system underneath of it. It's basically off of the structure inside, just coming out to the exterior. Then the idea is that you have to have that particular deck be able to direct water off of the building, so you have to have slope to it, and then you also have the support at the ends of it, so you try to make sure you have adequate support the length of that deck, and you make sure it's pitched away from the building to get the drainage off of it.
In our experience, there have been many cases, in fact almost all the cases we've been involved in have involved some form of moisture infiltration into buildings from decks or balconies. And I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably. In your experience, what are the most common deficiencies with decks or balconies?
Well, and the common deficiency comes just from the fact of how a deck or a balcony generally is. It's attached directly to the structure of the building in most cases. Well, in that case, you're puncturing through whatever cladding you have, and then you got windows or doors generally above that deck. So you've got ready supply of water coming down on the top surface that you have to find ways to go around it. And generally the problem comes from the flashing of the condition where the deck comes up to a vertical wall of how to get that juncture sealed, and if there's a door, how that threshold's sealed to make sure it's continuous and the water can go behind the deck at that location.
I noticed that in many of our cases where fiberglass is used as a coating on top of wood decking, there seems to be a serious problem with moisture infiltration. Why is that?
Well, there's a lot of problems with the fiberglass. It's a very brittle material in the sense that if you have handrails positioned on top, fastening through that, you're going to puncture it, and it eventually will wear down. The wearing surface of it, just with activity of people being on the decks, it may puncture through those. And then when you get to the edges where you come up at the walls, you have a problem of how to terminate that and properly flash it. And we've seen the most common real problem with it is where you have a door threshold, because of how to bring that up and then transition it back underneath of the door. Generally, most times we see it just stops underneath the door and it isn't put back underneath the door itself.
So there's no counter flashing underneath at all?
That's correct. And then you've got the problem of water coming down the wall, can go right behind the deck at that location.
All right. So in addition to flashings that are improperly done or missing, and fiberglass that's not properly applied or has handrails put through it or other penetrations, what about back pitching? Is that a problem that you see frequently?
That's frequently a problem. And again, that in and of itself may not be a problem if you have proper flashings or proper terminations of the deck, but if you have a ready supply of water falling on the surface and it's directed back towards the building and you have any of those flashing issues or termination issues, water goes right back behind the deck.
In your experience, why are decks back pitched? Is that intended by the architect who designed the buildings?
No. It generally, I would say, is shown to have some kind of slope to it to make sure water drains away from the building. But what happens when you're doing that construction, if you're off just a little bit with the framing elevations or aren't careful that you're making the exterior support of that balcony or deck at a lower height, then you're going to have the problem. It goes back towards the building.
And what about structural failure of decks? Have you observed that type of a condition?
Yes, and it's one where especially the framing at the outermost edge of a deck can have so much water directed to it. If there's a flashing issue, it's not terminated at the edge right, water's going to go in there and just funnel into that area all the time.
Now, I know we've worked together on cases where you have multi-story townhouse construction, 3, 4, 5 stories high, with columns resting on top of decks, and you've observed structural failure in those circumstances. What were the types of circumstances that you've seen that caused structural failure?
Well, in some of those cases, again, with the water coming to the exterior face and the juncture of those columns with the framing that's sitting on those columns, that's usually a termination where you have to have a flashing that caps that juncture. If that flashing's not proper, it'll go right into where the framing on top of that column and the column itself will be subjected to all the water coming off the deck, and it will basically deteriorate it very quickly.
So once that happens, the loads that are being carried from above can no longer be safely transferred down to the ground?
That's correct, because you have the stacking of a column right over the top of another column, and if the water damage is occurring all the way down through those, it's just going to get worse as you go down. And then if they're not properly fastened, you got problems with whether the columns in there are properly installed as to be kept in place if there was a problem with the structure or any kind of loads that would shift it.
Now, with high and mid-rise buildings, decks are often made out of concrete. They're cantilevered, and they're built sometimes with filigree slabs inside of a cast iron frame, and sometimes not. What type of structural failure have you seen of those types of decks?
Well, what happens with those generally, we've seen that become a problem where you have the termination of the deck. You have a deck sticking out from the wall, but at the juncture where it meets the wall, you still have to properly protect that juncture so water doesn't come off the deck or off the wall and get behind. In those locations, it can get right to the structural framing, and if it's steel or wood, doesn't matter, water's not good to those. It's going to make them deteriorate.
So eventually it'll rot the wood?
Yes.
And rust it away to the point where the balcony is no longer structurally sound?
That's correct. And it basically, with that hanging off the building, that's not good.